Namaste everyone and welcome to Vichar Manthan. My name is Neeti and I will be your chair for this evening. Tonight we will be discussing the topic, should faith schools have a place in modern Britain? Now before I dive into our topic and the purpose of Vichar Manthan, I would like to provide the audience with a brief introduction about myself. I was born in India and grew up in London. I graduated with a degree in English literature, followed by a master's from Queen Mary University of London. Having a keen interest in teaching from a young age, I went on to complete a PGCE in English at King's College London. I currently teach secondary level English at a boys' grammar school in Surrey. I bring my view to today's topic from a newly qualified teacher's perspective on whether faith schools have a place in modern Britain. So, what is Vichar Manthan? For those who are watching us for the first time, the phrase Vichar Manthan originates from Sanskrit, and it literally means the churning of ideas or thoughts. Vichar Manthan, or VM for short, is an independent voluntary organization that is built around the idea that by earnestly exploring the toughest challenges in our society through varying viewpoints, we can each of us develop some deeper insights. Vichar Manthan offers a platform, like we have set up today, where we invite expert speakers within a subject to churn out thoughts and ideas. And we encourage you to take this manthan, this churning, into your own homes. Vichar Manthan explores topics pertinent to British society through a Hindu civilizational lens. Ultimately, we believe that there is much wisdom that can be unlocked through dialogue. We do thank you for your time and support, especially our well-wishers. With your contributions, we are able to host these events. As a voluntary organization hosting free events, VM relies on your contributions to grow stronger and keep putting on more events. You can support our events with your time and energy, or by becoming a well-wisher and donating a one-off amount, or making regular contributions from as little as £1 per month. That all being said, I hope you all enjoy tonight's Vichar Manthan. Now, on to tonight's topic. Should faith schools have a place in modern Britain? Well, education develops the minds that determine the future of our society. Last year, 1.9 million children were educated in faith schools. We're going through unprecedented times, where the status quo is being challenged and our principles are being re-examined. This is the time to look at how we are building our future generations and what role, if any, faith schools have to play. To tackle today's topic, it is my great pleasure to introduce our three panelists for tonight. Our first panelist is Dr. Minlib Dal. Minlib is the HM King Abdullah II Ibn al-Hussein of Jordan Fellow for the Study of Love in Religion at Regent's Park College, Oxford. Following a doctorate at the University of Exeter in Islamic Studies and Christian-Muslim Relations, he has been visiting assistant professor at Hartford Seminary, Loyola University, New Orleans, Rosemont College, and Candler Divinity School. His research focuses on comparative mysticism in Islam and Christianity, with special interest in love mysticism. Minlib, welcome.
Thank you.
Our second panelist is Alistair Lichton. Alistair is National Secular Society's Education and Schools Campaigns Officer. He is currently leading in the No More Faith Schools campaign. Alistair has given a series of lectures across the country arguing against faith schools in Britain and also against having a bishop's bench in the House of Lords. Alistair, welcome.
Good evening.
And our final panelist for tonight is Sunil Randev. After graduating with a degree in business and law from the University of Leicester, Sunil spent 10 years as a monk at Bhakti Vedanta Manor in Watford, during which time he spent 2 years living in Vrindavan and Jagannath Puri studying the Bhagavad Gita. Sunil is currently head of the Hindu curriculum at the Krishna Avanti School in Leicester and a teacher at the College of Vedic Studies. Sunil, welcome. As we engage in a discussion, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask our panelists, feel free to type them into the comments section on YouTube. Our Manthan today will last for 90 minutes. The speakers will now get 5 minutes each to give their opening remarks on the topic, after which we'll hold our discussion. Without further ado, I'll pass you on to Minlib. Minlib, your opening remarks, please. Minlib, you are currently on mute. Thank you.
Is that right now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. So I was asking this opening remark to make 2 points. What is the purpose of schooling and education? And what is the purpose of faith school, as they are called in the UK? This is basically a modern debate. So education or schooling, the main purpose of it is to provide for the larger possible members of our community the fullest possible development of each learner. Basically, teach them or instill in them skills and tap into all the potentials that are within each member. So how to live morally, creatively, productively in a society that calls itself liberal and democratic. So that sets of goals, right, are in general what schooling is about, from kindergarten until whatever. So it's larger than a set of skills and to get a job. Even though folks who are not, who have enough, don't need to earn a living, they need an education, right? So education has to tap into all that potentiality so they can offer the best possible member of a community. Now, what is that? Does it make any difference if it's a faith school or not? In fact, no. Faith school add to that list an ethos of religious faith, characteristics. That means that faith school, on top of what I just said, wants the students to be exposed to what I can call an added value. And that added value is called faith or religious tradition. So the debate now that we'll get into will come later. But I think that's the way I see it. Both of them have about the same goals and objectives. Faith school have an extra added aspect to it. And that is the place where the debate lies. All right, I'm done.
Thank you, Minlib. Thank you for your opening remarks. I will now like to pass the opening remarks to Sunil. Your opening remarks, please.
Thank you. So whether a school is a faith school or whether the school is a non-faith school, I think the key word in both of them is school, is education. And education, I think, is there to help develop well-rounded human beings that will be a credit to whatever society they live in. I think faith schools can provide one way of achieving that end. Non-faith schools can also provide a way of achieving that end. So as a teacher at Avanti, we take a three-pillared approach in helping develop children into well-rounded, productive members of society. So the first pillar is academic excellence through the national curriculum, and so forth. So, challenging children academically. The second is through character formation, which is given equal importance to the academics. So this is the second pillar. So character formation means that if you want to change the face of society, if you want to improve the situation of the world, then that begins with improving oneself first. So character formation in the Avanti schools essentially means that we focus on 6 universal principles. And I call them universal values because they're not a monopoly of the Hindu faith. They're not a monopoly of anyone. They're universal, faith or non-faith. And they're essentially gratitude, empathy, courage, respect, self-discipline, and integrity. And these are given equal importance in the education of children that come to our schools. And the third pillar, which supports the whole Avanti ethos, is spiritual insight. The spiritual insight essentially means exploring our interconnectedness with the world around us, not just with other people, but essentially with nature, with the world. And we explore topics such as identity, purpose, the divine. We explore the concept of faith, personal connection with the divine. And therefore, it's a holistic approach to education. So it's not just academics. The academic excellence is also supported by character formation and spiritual insight. And with these 3, we believe that we have the perfect, or not the perfect, but a good blend in which to achieve the goal of creating, well-rounded human beings, which will be a credit to any society, any community they choose to live in.
Thank you, Sunil, for your opening remarks. I will now like to pass on to Alistair. Alistair, your opening remarks, please.
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you, obviously, for the 2 preceding panelists. So in my opening statement, I was asked to address the role of schools in society and why we are against faith schools. In my mind, these are linked. So there's lots of things that we come together as a society to fund collectively for the common good that have an instrumental purpose. So the reason we build roads is to move goods and people around. The reason we build hospitals is to heal diseases. And we can justify schools in that sort of instrumental way, so that schools teach facts. But beyond this instrumental purpose, they have a higher purpose, because schools are the vehicle through which we realize children's rights to an open future. We all have an interest in schools, whether our children attend them, and even whether or not we have children ourselves. In a liberal, secular society, when we come together, regardless of our personal differences or backgrounds, but when we work together to build something we share, when we use our taxes to invest in the next generation, we should do this on the basis of shared values. And we already see this in action in our community schools and in most of our public services. And the example, my favorite example I like to use, and partly because it's one of the things I'm really missing during lockdown, is libraries. Now, we have a long history of private libraries, including many important religious ones, which are funded voluntarily and they set their own rules. But we also have public libraries funded socially. And a public library is not a morally neutral place. Its very existence is a result of moral decisions. But a public library can be morally non-partisan. It is underpinned by shared values of equality, freedom of speech, and pluralism, but personal worldviews aren't privileged. So the librarian may object to the religious, political, or cookbook that you pick up from the shelves, but they serve you equally. Even the religion and belief section in most libraries doesn't tend to privilege the subject or specific views, treating it as simply another area of interest with different ideas and criticisms. The pluralism of the library is about providing a space for ideas, not about propping up specific worldviews. So, As to whether or not faith schools have show a role in today's state education system in a liberal, secularist society, I would argue not. Now, that leaves open the discussion of the rights and wrongs and the necessities or choices involved in having faith schools in the past. The role of voluntary and particularly religious organizations in establishing schools prior to the move towards a universal state-funded education system is an important but different issue. I would ask the audience to think for a moment. Can you think of a single state-funded public service or even area of public life where we would permit the sort of discrimination we see in faith schools? Would we build a road only for or to promote a specific worldview? Would we have Muslim dentists, Christian doctor surgeries, Hindu police stations? I think most of us would find those ideas ridiculous. Um, Similarly, schools are forbidden from promoting, showing favoritism to, or discriminating on the grounds of partisan political beliefs. Political beliefs can be just as all-consuming and meaningful to people as religious beliefs, but it's only really an accident of history that partisan religious beliefs are treated so differently. No one really suggests that the lack of state-funded conservative comprehensives, nationalist nurseries, or socialist secondaries is an affront to political freedom. There are no Labour voters who feel aggrieved that their local school doesn't favour them over their Lib Dem or Conservative neighbours. I hope there's an opportunity tonight to move beyond the more simplistic arguments for faith schools. No, they don't actually promote choice, and they don't actually achieve particularly better results in any way, and they're not necessary for religious freedom. Faith schools are a choice, and we should discuss that choice and what it means about how we view the purpose of schools and what it means for a liberal society. My case against faith schools does not rest on simplicity. I don't pretend that all faith schools are equally problematic. I don't pretend that change can simply happen overnight or that all levels of discrimination are the same. But there are both practical and principled reasons why we should move beyond a faith school system. An end to faith schools would not impose conformity or be without compromise. As you know, our system of community schools, again, already demonstrates. The transition to a fully community school system can gain broad consent as part of the continuing evolution from a voluntary to a universal state education system. And I look forward to discussing those ideas.
Thank you, Alistair, for your opening remarks. Thank you, gentlemen, for your opening remarks. I would like to now move this discussion forward and pose my first question to Minlib and bringing the idea that you spoke about the ethos in faith schools. I wanted to ask you, Minlib, is it important for Christians to have faith schools, considering 70% of all faith schools are Christian? And if it is, why?
Well, first of all, when people send their kid to school, right? So we fall under various categories, put it that way, right? Some believe, some don't, some are in the between, and whatever. You know, just you have the whole. So if you're talking about Britain, and you pay attention to the history of Britain itself, paying attention to the connection that has existed in this country between religion, schooling, and education, right? That's what I was saying at the beginning. This debate is highly a modern debate. It didn't exist until the idea that what is the location or what does religion play in the public space or in distribution of public wealth or power, whatever you want to call it. So we are in this modern state, and the debate of this modern state is not just if you have faith schools look at faith in school, it's everywhere, right? It's faith in parliament, and so on and so on. I mean, so if you take schools, you look at the location in which we are, Britain, the population of Britain, the distribution of the population of Britain in terms of those who believe or those who do not believe, in terms of his own historical development, right? So you have, naturally, the statistic that you gave, 70%. So a good number of Christian taxpayers, right, who believe, want their sons and daughters to go to a school where what they consider to be a key component for what does it mean to be human being for them, right, is part of the ethos of the school. So the debate, in my view, will be in which way a community could accommodate the cosmopolitan nature of his community, of his society, and yet attend to the different needs that are there. It's very important because it's not just those who are given the possibility of being exposed to some kind of a school. It's also all the different manners in which schooling or education, quality education, reach the variety of people, like people with disabilities, for example, and so on. You know, so the landscape is complex. The idea is how you organize a community in such a way that you minimize inequality or access to good education by paying attention or offering the possibility of those who would like to have a faith component in their lives.
Minlib, I would like to steer you here towards the question of why is it so important for Christians to have Christian schools, considering the 70% of all faith schools are Christian based. So I'd like to steer you towards the why.
The why, okay. I think the first why is historical. The second why has to do with what I said at the beginning. Christians in the UK still believe, right, that they need schools where their kids will be exposed in a milieu that is congruent with the kind of faith that they have, right?
Thank you for that, Minlib. Alistair, I'd like to bring you into this conversation now. Minlib's spoken about that faith exists in a lot of public spheres. It also exists in the parliament. And I'd also like to mention that you've argued against the bishop's bench at House of Lords.
Yeah, so I think that's interesting. So one of the points Minlib made, but first of all, you're right. This is in some ways a modern debate because the idea of universal education, just the very idea that children does have a right to an education, a primary and secondary, that's a comparatively modern idea. But as soon as that idea began to gain wide acceptance, the move from a voluntary sort of hodgepodge system of local charities and local churches towards a universal system was in motion. So the debate about what sort of how as a society we should organize our schools has gone on for as long as we've actually had the idea that schools are something society should provide. I think part of the misconception here. So you talk about there are Christian taxpayers and who want Christian schools, but I mean, again, there are Manchester United supporting taxpayers. There are cricket playing taxpayers. There are black taxpayers, white taxpayers, gay taxpayers, straight taxpayers, Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem, UKIP. I mean, it's a strange thing to pick faith and say, well, then they should have schools organized around that. And that can lead us into framing this as a religious versus a non-religious argument. And so it was here, so Christians want faith schools. Well, actually, everyone, I think, wants good schools. And we all have pretty actually shared ideas about what exactly makes a school. Now, again, if we start looking at detail, we have healthy arguments, disagreements, but at a broad level, we agree on the fundamentals that make a good school, by and large. So it is really an accident of history that we take one form of identity, religious identity, and say schools should be organized around that, because there are other forms of identity, class identity, political identity, which are equally as important to people, but we don't decide to organize schools around that. We don't need to privilege religion in order for religion to survive. Parents, families, communities raise their children, raise the members of that community within a worldview. How we don't necessarily need that worldview to be the basis of state schools. Christian parents pass on their Christian values to their children. Atheist parents pass on their atheist values to their children. We're a majority non-religious country, but we don't have any schools which are organized around, like no schools, even in the private sector, which are organized around non-religion.
Alistair, I'd just like to pause you there. My follow-up question to you would be, do you think is there a role for some sort of ethical, moral framework being taught in school? And if so, what should be taught?
I'm not aware of any schools in which an ethical, moral framework isn't taught. So Sunil was talking about the 6 key values at their school, and that, of course, brilliant. They're great values, and those sorts of values will be praised in all schools. There is not a school in the country that doesn't teach children to be kind, that teach children that bullying is wrong. Schools are not a morally neutral, it's not a moral vacuum. If you don't have a faith ethos, you don't have a moral vacuum, you have the basic shared community values of a school. A problem when you impose and put a faith framework on that. For example, so I read a lot of reports of Church of England inspections of Church of England faith schools. And one of the really worrying things I see is I will see a report say that a school is good because the children there are kind, they care about the environment, they value the whole community, and then criticize the school for not framing that in an exclusively Christian way. Or equally, will claim that these sorts of values, which should be promoted and are promoted in all schools, are uniquely belonging to a particular religion when they are part of our shared community heritage. Every school in the country is required, for example, to promote spiritual, moral, social, and cultural development. Schools don't teach facts and simple sums and definitions of words. They're not fact passing machines. They are educating processes.
Thank you, Alistair. Minlib, I want to go back to the history that you brought up in your previous statement. The history of education in this country. I mean, historically, vocational education always existed in our society, and it was only around late 6th century that cathedrals and monasteries started to provide an education, and that too was only for boys who were to become monks and priests, which then led to a social service that started around 1800s, I believe, and that was to provide education for children from poor families. How would you reconcile the answer that you gave previously about ethos and the modern education sphere that we have, or could you give us some additional context on this point?
Well, take the example of Oxford. How did our folks start? Activity to school. That's the beginning of it. Yale. How did Yale start? Look at the Ivy League in the USA. I mean, they all started with some kind of divinity school and then moved, So the issue is quite clear. You're right. In the West, when you want to talk about the rise of the universities, what is it? Bologna claimed to be the first one at the end of the 11th century, right? 11 something, 12th century. And then here, you know, you have early 1200, you have all those Salamanca, all those schools. And who were the major people who went to there, who taught there? I mean, we still do that here. So historically, it's not just in the West. In the Muslim tradition, it's the same, right? So the connection historically is there. That, you know, now we're talking about modernity, right? I think the debate is the modern debate, and we got to take that modern debate seriously, because what the modern debate is raising that question, like I said, for all the institutions that are produced in the West, you know, so they all have to rethink seriously a new paradigm, and that new paradigm has to struggle with where do you locate faith, tradition, and religion? Because the secular idea is to make religion a private business, right? A private business in the sense that religion does not play the defining role in a particular society or a state as it did in the medieval time, right? So the question, at least for me, the question, what do you call it? Alistair, what you gave the example of libraries and so on and so on. My take on it is institutions have commonalities, but they do have single differences. I can't say that this institution, the parliament, should work like a library works, or the library should work exactly as another institution works in the nation, right? So what I'm looking for in this debate is in which way those different institutions with particular goals to achieve manage it in such a way that those who take seriously their faith traditions find themselves to be equally treated in their different institutions, particularly here in funding, education, and schooling.
Thank you, Minlib. If I may just bring Sunil in here. It sounds like Alistair was talking about the values being universal. So Sunil, if values are universal, why do they have to be wrapped in religion?
Very good question, and I appreciate that point. My point is that yes, these values are being taught in non-faith schools, but probably not in the same level of depth and the same emphasis as faith schools. So for example, when I went to school, I can't remember the last time a teacher went, you know, in the class, sat down and did a whole, you know, took me into the, you know, about being grateful for things in this world, to the level of depth that you get it in faith school. So for example, at our school, we have 3 terms broadly across all schools. You have the autumn, the spring, and the summer. Each term is split into 2. So you have 6 half terms throughout the whole year. Each half term, we focus exclusively on one of these values, looking at it from a religious perspective, looking at it from a non-religious perspective, and it's a whole school collective effort. When children are taught at school, they need to be taught again and again and again and again for it to really be sunk in, you know, repetition. So when you have a whole school approach, okay, not just one teacher maybe talking about it in one class, someone mentions it in an assembly, you know, one day, we're talking about a whole collective effort where the teachers buy into the ethos, where, you know, is the same value is looked at every day for a period of 6 weeks. I would say that, yeah, you know, it is taught outside faith schools, but in a faith school, at least at the Vanti schools, it's part of the ethos of the school. You know, the teachers share the, you know, teachers children the same message. They go into those values deeper to really give children a more enriching perspective of it. And I don't think we get that in non-faith schools. I can't remember that, at least when I went through the British schooling system. all of which were non-faith, I can't remember getting that. So therefore, I think that adds a greater impact on the development of the children in terms of their moral literacy than they would get from non-faith schools. Because I think the primary reason is because the shift has gone away from character development to more academics. You know, when the league tables are published, they're published on performance. Performance essentially means how many A to C grades are they getting. And I think that's left not a complete moral vacuum, but a significant one. And I think faith schools are one way in which we can fulfill that. I'm not saying it's the only way, but they play a significant part because these values are intrinsic in the Hindu faith. Yes, they are universal, and because they're universal, it means they're also in Hindu faith. And therefore, when we look at it, say we're looking at gratitude for 6 weeks. For 1 week, we'll focus on gratitude from a faith perspective. The next week, we will look at gratitude from a non-faith perspective. The third week, we may look at gratitude from a poem and focus on a poem for that week. Another week, it might be a person, you know, celebrity or someone who did something, and see their lifestyle and try to understand the value from different perspectives, not necessarily a religious way. So I think to conclude that essentially, yes, other schools do look at, you know, values and character, but not quite to the depth and a whole school approach, which I think has more of an impact in developing these values in children.
Thank you, Sunilji. I just would like to address the audience here before we move on. We will be having an audience Q&A with the panel, so do note down your questions and viewpoints in the comment section, and they will be relayed to the panel. Alistair, I'd like to bring you into this. When Sunil was talking about faith schools teaching these moral, ethical values, you opposed in your stance. What is your take on that?
I'm glad Sunil doesn't think that community schools are a complete moral vacuum, just mostly a moral vacuum. Again, there is a great debate among educationists at the moment about character education. We do see the value of non-academic issues within education, but you have good faith schools that do aspects well, and community schools, and some schools do certain things well and some things do stuff badly. But there isn't, in order to do what you want to do well, there isn't the need to put it within an exclusive faith ethos. By framing the school in the faith ethos, that's restricting it. Then, let alone all the other discriminatory issues you get with different forms of faith schools. And there's this not a complete dichotomy. I don't want to. I'm not straw manning your position here, but both of you have suggested there is this tension, this dichotomy between you need faith schools or faith just doesn't, values don't happen. But within a liberal secular society, is not a completely religious free society. I don't think there's any form of any secularists who say we should have there's no room for religion, and people can be very motivated by their religion, but we don't build institutions around. We don't make that the central organizing principle of institutions which are shared. Someone might be motivated by their faith to go into teaching, or to go into any other form of public service. But I mean, if someone was motivated by their faith to become a doctor, great and wonderful, but we wouldn't expect that they then should have a hospital organized around that faith. Why, to say that faith should be a personal thing is not to say it should be locked. It's a private thing that should be just locked away, because we shouldn't lock away and make private any aspects of our identity. But identity should not be something we all, your own personal identity should not be something that we make the center of something that is so shared and important and should be about opening perspectives as schools?
Thank you, Alistair. On that note, I would like to bring in all panelists here and ask this question. Is there a space for the creation of a set of great British values that brings us together outside of faith? And if so, what 3 values would you pick? And I'd like to direct that question first to Minlib. And I'd like the other speakers to then reflect on my question. Minlib, your answer.
Okay. So the question is, which value in the British society?
Is there a space for the creation of a set of great British values that brings us together outside of faith? And if so, what 3 values or which 3 values would you pick?
3, right? Outside of faith.
Yes, outside of faith.
I would say obedience to authority, right? Family ties, family, the value of family life. The third one, I don't know, but the cherishment of freedom.
Thank you, Minlib. I'd like to direct the same question to Sunil. Is there a space for the creation of a set of great British values that brings us together outside of faith? And if so, which 3 values would you pick?
I think there is. If I were to pick 3 values, compassion, I would say, justice, and forgiveness. If I were to pick 3, I mean, they're the ones that immediately came into my mind. They're the 3.
Thank you. And Alistair, your 3 values, please.
I mean, the other panelists are so nice. We'll get along. We can get along, can't we? The values, I think, of a liberal society are about individual human dignity and collective human cooperation, and those are the basis by which we form, I think, all the laws. I'm not sure if any society could function without where the balance is. So individual human dignity and collective human cooperation, and that's only 2. So complaining about the weather.
Thank you so much, Alistair. I'd like to bring Sunil back into this conversation. Sunil, you mentioned compassion and justice as part of your as part of the values that you mentioned, and also I'd like to bring back the notion of social service and considering the current statistics that we have, whereby most faith schools are oversubscribed, and as well as with extremely low percentage of students from underprivileged backgrounds, and considering that the initial education of faith schools began as part of social service to support the society's underprivileged. Sunil, what is your take on that? How do you justify the oversubscription and the low representation of students from underprivileged backgrounds?
Sure. So I think one thing, oversubscription shows that there is a demand for faith schools. They add something different into the education of children. And I think people appreciate that. When we're opening up one of our faith schools in Croydon, we went to the local community and asked 4,000 people, only 10% of which were Hindu. Would you support a Krishna Avanti Hindu faith school in your local area? And 93% of them said yes, based on the ethos of the school. So I think there is a demand for faith schools. Secondly, in terms of them having relatively low numbers of children from different backgrounds, I would say faith schools have the power to be selective in their admission. And I think that is one issue with faith schools. I'm not saying that faith schools are absolutely perfect, because there've been plenty of examples of faith schools that just been disastrous. and they have become selective just to pick the best in society. I think at the Vanti schools, we accept anyone from any background. Religious consideration is not even, a religious thing isn't even consideration. That applies to children, and that also applies to staff as well. Very, very important. Half of our staff, teachers and teaching assistants, are from non-Hindu families. Some of them are Muslim, they come to school wearing a burqa. Some of them have no faith, but they all buy into the ethos of the school. In fact, the head teacher himself is of no particular faith, and he's doing a fantastic job. So I think that's one thing which I would pick out about faith schools, that the selectiveness in their criteria to only pick either people, children from their particular faith or from particular backgrounds. I think that's wrong. And I think, you know, this should be open to everyone. So we have children from, you know, disadvantaged backgrounds, and our doors are open to everyone. So that would be my answer to that.
Thank you, Sunil. Thank you very much. Being very conscious of the time, I would now have to move on to the audience Q&A, but really great points, gentlemen. The first question is to Sunil and then to Minlib from Anamiko Tel. The question is, in a faith school, how do you reconcile the teaching of miracles alongside physics? Sunil, I'd like you to give your answer to that question.
Yeah, I think miracle is something which you just can't explain rationally. And I think in life, there are many things that happen that you just can't connect all the dots and explain it through scientific, scientific ways. There's things around us that happen all the time which can't be explained through science, and some things can. So if it can't be explained through science or physics, sometimes they're labeled as miracles. So for example, if someone gets knocked over by a car and, medically they should have died, but they didn't die, and we're not sure why that is, we will label that a miracle. So I think it's just probably off the unexplained. So I don't think, there's necessarily that faith schools promote, angels and, all these, celestial things, which contradict science. And I think exposing children to both is fine. As long as you don't promote one over the other and say, well, actually, it's only this and everything else is wrong. That exclusivist mentality that we find, not only in faith schools, but in anything, that either that this is the only way, this is only the right way, and everything is wrong. I think let children be exposed to both the physics and the divine or miraculous, whatever you want to call it, and let them make their own minds.
Okay, thank you. Minlib, your take on that? Your take on how would you reconcile the teaching of miracles alongside physics?
Well, I think we have to be serious and make a difference between science and what is religion and faith, right? So I don't think we should be teaching miracles. We can't turn schools into Sunday church business. No, we have to be serious in the sense that we teach what the curriculum is about. We teach science in its own right, and we don't mix it with the religious faith. So when you are teaching science, you teach science like it's done everywhere with what is the fact, whatever is the way it's done. You don't mix it with when you're doing church business. Church business will come later, or church business has its place. What is important is to separate the two. Don't confuse the genre. It's to separate the two in such a way that you form a student who does physics like it's done everywhere and become one day a physician or an astrophysicist. No, if that's the kind of mind you're forming, what is miracles? So I think if you separate the genre very clearly and you teach what is needed in each category, we don't have to be worried about what miracle does. Miracle doesn't come into science as far as I'm concerned. Separate them, that's it.
Thank you for that, Minlib. There's another question to you from Ian Farrell. His question is, with reference to obedience to authority in the UK, the law is secular. How do you reconcile faith beliefs which contradict the law?
Well, that's also, well, okay. Let's start with this. The example in a society, particularly in these modern liberal societies that have a long tradition of faith or religion being, right? The shift is still going on, right? How do we shift in the Western world from a world that was dominated by religious belief in almost in its entire institutions into a community that's largely secular, right? Where religion doesn't play the role that it used to play. Now, that is the debate. For me, this is it. How do the law voted? It is got to be the law. The French said the law is what? Is the expression of the general will. So it has to apply to everybody, right? Faith or no faith. So I think that takes the higher ground. The higher ground is you make a law so that everybody, faith or no faith, is under the law. That's the way I see it.
Thank you for answering that question, Minlib. Alistair, I have a question that has just come up for you. It's a question from Sham Mavani. The question is, if the success of faith schools connected to their ethos and character, is there something non-faith schools can learn from them?
Thanks. I don't believe there is the success of faith schools being linked necessarily to their character, because you get, awful faith schools and awful community schools and good and bad. I mean, the evidence that faith schools perform better academically is incredibly weak. You do see some small differences, but comparing two schools in different settings is very difficult. There's overwhelming evidence that the religious selectivity of schools does lead to a social selection, and very important point Sunil makes is that not all faith schools do discriminate in their admissions, but it is the religious selection which the web evidence very strongly suggests leads to the social economic selection. You get pupils from more advantaged backgrounds. I think some faith schools do better summer fates. They do better bake sales. I've seen that firsthand. Maybe that's the way in which the ethos contributes to the school being better. But I mean, there's just the evidence isn't really there, and when you compare to all the other problems with faith schools, I don't think doing 1/7 of the grade better at GCSE really covers it.
Thank you, Alistair. Sunil, I'd like to bring you into this. The same question. If the success of faith schools connected to their ethos and character, is there something non-faith schools can learn from them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think everyone can learn from each other. I don't think that, either faith or non-faith have, got it perfect in every single way. I mean, even at the building of Krishna Avanti, a lot of the teachers came from non-faith schools, and they brought good working practices from those non-faith schools into Avanti to enrich, the student experience in our schools. I think, there was a survey many years ago done that showed, what were the three main problems of teachers in 1940s. And those three main problems were sticking chewing gum under the desk, talking in class, and lateness. The same survey was done in the 90s, so it's quite an old one. And it was gun crime, it was drugs, and it was mental health issues. And you can see that even now. In fact, there was one school I remember reading in Texas that any new teacher that came into the school, they were issued with their locker, their classroom. These are the children you'll be with, and a standard school issued revolver for their own protection and safety. So I think that huge emphasis on spirituality, in the sense that it creates mental resilience, that huge emphasis on thinking about others and not just thinking about ourselves. that huge emphasis on in faith schools about, you know, money, you know, your wealth is measured by not how much you have, but actually by the things that money can't buy. That emphasis on personal resolution leads to global revolution. I think, you know, non-faith schools can take that aspect and maybe emphasize, you know, that more, because it's intrinsic in the faith. Constantly assessing ourselves, constantly improving, constantly reaching out more to other people, constantly trying to think about others more than ourselves. I think these are things which are intrinsic in faith. You can't separate the two. And I think, you know, people can take that from faith schools just as much as we can take from non-faith schools. It's about cooperation and learning from each other.
Thank you, Sunil. Alistair, I have a question for you from Sachin Nanda. Should faith schools be privatized? Considering you argue that state should not be funding faith schools, do you think the faith schools should then be privatized?
No, and the important thing is, there's no way to anyone could click their fingers and suddenly we get rid of faith schools. What we advocate that there should be a transition towards a fully community ethos school system. Now, how exactly that takes place, that would be a process, and that would be a process that would need to build consent. It would need to we would need to have a top aim to have a community ethos school system, and there would need to be some sort of process, grassroots way that it goes through. So, for example, in Northern Ireland, which we have a terribly segregated school system, 93% of pupils in Northern Ireland attend religiously segregated schools effectively. There is a democratic process there by which a school can transform to become integrated. We may see, if we move to a fully community ethos school system, some small number of schools leave the state system to join a private school system. I don't think, you know, considering that these are effectively almost entirely state funded, I don't see that would happen possibly. You know, so schools would simply lose the religious character. They would lose the Equality Act exemption, so there would be no special treatment under equality law that allow them to be faith schools, and they would just basically transition to community system. I mean, we wouldn't get rid of the buildings, etc. It would just be a process of transition.
Thank you, Alistair. Sunil, I want your take on this. Do you think faith schools should be privatized, or do you agree with what Alistair has said?
I think, you know, state schools are funded primarily by the government. And I think the government should fund any school which will add value to children. That should be the primary consideration. That's what our education system is about. It's about the children first and everything that will benefit them. If there's a faith school which can be proven to add value to children and develop, as I said, well-rounded human beings that can integrate in society, and they're transparent, then I think the government should fund them. It should come from tax, because it's for the greater good. If there's a faith school that wants government funding, and they, you know, they become closed, they have fanatical interpretations of their faith, and they cause segregation, which are against the modern, you know, liberal values, then no, they shouldn't be funded. Just the same with any other school. So I think rather than seeing whether it's a faith school or whether it's not a faith school, government funding should be given to any school which can be proven to add value to the children and produce, you know, good model citizens. And that should be the primary consideration.
Sunil, I have a follow-up question on that. You talk about the discrimination and radicalization. Although faith schools are funded by state, there is no external body that regulates what is being taught in religious education in schools. So if there is no way to monitor what is being taught in those classes of religious education, is that fair, or shouldn't state then have that ability to then regulate and monitor what exactly is being taught?
Yeah, absolutely. They should, because I think faith schools, there's a certain negative connotation with faith schools that, you know, they cause segregation and so forth. And I think to dispel some of that connotation, faith schools need to be as open and as transparent as possible. So, you know, at the Vanti School, we're not required to follow the national curriculum, but we do. Ofsted do come and they inspect everything. But there's also something called the Section 48. So Section 48 is a section under the Educational Act, I think, of 2005. And essentially, it's a requirement for all schools that have a religious character to be inspected for the faith aspect, if that makes sense. So we at Krishnavanti at the primary school, we had ours in 2017. And there were two inspectors that came. One of the inspectors was from the faith itself to make sure that the faith ethos is being implemented in the correct way. And secondly, was an independent inspector. And together, what they did a very thorough and robust examination of the school. It's a bit like an Ofsted for faith schools. So they spoke to the teachers, they spoke to the leadership team, they pulled parents over at the beginning and at the end of the school day, spoke to them and interviewed them. They were taking children out of their classes into separate areas and speaking with them. They spoke to children that weren't from Hindu faith, that weren't from an Indian background, that were at the school, asking, how do you feel in this school? They came into my classes and they sat through making notes, asking the children questions. They looked through every single book of every child in the school with regards to their philosophy, PRE, philosophy, religious ethics. And a report was formed, and it's graded the same as Ofsted, where you have, outstanding, good, and so forth. And we were just shy of outstanding. So I think that openness, that transparency is essential for any school, but particularly faith schools. And we've all seen what happens when that transparency is taken away. Then all sorts of questionable practices have an opportunity to then occur.
Thank you, Sunil. I have a question from Ravi Ladva here. Does the influence of religion create segregation in schools, for example, for minorities who do not have access to their own faith schools? And I'd like to direct this question to Alistair.
That's a complicated one, because we have issues in our country around segregation, discrimination, marginalization of minority groups, which are separate to faith schools. I would never pretend that getting rid of faith schools would sweep away any problems with segregation, with clique forming, etc. But if you organize schools around particular religion, and you particularly where you've got selective admissions, or even just not selective admissions but a community pressure to attend separate schools, that sort of segregation, I mean, it's undeniable that is a result of different types of education. Now, obviously, not every faith school is as guilty of segregation and driving segregation as others. No one's pretending that. If we didn't have faith schools, I mean, say every school had open admissions, or even if we had, as some things suggested, we had faith schools but not discriminatory admissions, but open admissions, you would still have demographic differences between schools. Different groups are not equally spread out through the country, so you would still have schools in which there are larger numbers of particular demographics, and schools do need experience in dealing with that. So if you have a school that is entirely of one demographic, which is made more likely by faith schools but isn't an exclusive issue to faith schools, then that group needs to be able to meet people from other backgrounds. Because it's easy to it's difficult to hate people, we know this when it comes to sexuality, ethnicity, class. it's easy to hate an idea of someone. It's easy to have negative views of an idea of someone. It's more difficult to have negative views of someone like, you know, you played football at school together, you shared crisps at lunch, etc.
Thank you, Alistair. Thank you for that answer. Minlib, there is a question for you from George Ballantyne. Government defines 4 British values for schools to teach: democracy, rule of law, individual liberty, mutual respect for and tolerance of those with different faiths and belief, and for those without faith. Sorry, it's quite a wordy question. What should be done about faith schools that actively teach a difference between believers and non-believers?
Well, if that way of teaching produces any form of discrimination, of inequality, that should be a wrong thing to do. So that's my answer. Faith school, like Sunil was saying, do need to abide by the rules that other institutions abide by, right? So, you know, it's like that's what I'm saying to Alistair. Institutions that we have all have their problems. And the idea here is, how do they improve over time? How do they take care of different, you know, we're talking about poor people don't get, I mean, look at Oxford. Who comes to Oxford? I mean, Oxford is not a fair school, but who goes here? I mean, you know, it's people who have money, who, you know, this is it. What you do with it. So the idea for me, this is it. The idea for me is that how institutions like improve by getting into those, you know, 4 major things that he said. How do faith schools keep up with that and watch carefully what detract them from that? That's what I'll say.
Thank you for that, Minlib. Sunil, coming to you, I have a question from Vera Goody-Metler. The question is, by funding a faith school, is the government not aiding the promotion of a particular faith?
No, because I think they fund many faith schools. I think by funding a faith school, the government are promoting one way, not the only way, but one way which can add value to the lives of children. I don't think when the government fund Krishna Avanti, they're doing it simply to, you know, promote Hinduism as the way and the only way. No, I don't think that's the case. I think that, as I said before, if the government are going to stop funding simply on the basis of faith, as opposed to, can they tangibly see a pathway in which it can add value to the children by going to this school? That sends a wrong message that our opposition of faith in schools is more important than actually what will add value to the lives of the children. And coming back to, you know, it's the point that Alistair made earlier about roads, you know, they're there for the common good. All schools are there for the common good. But if, you know, roads aren't the only way to get around. You've got plane, you've got ship, you've got boat, and so forth. So in the same way, for the common good of children, for the common good of a greater society, there are many ways in which we can achieve that. And faith schools, I believe, play an important part, but it's not the only part.
Alistair, I'd like to bring you into this. Do you agree with Sunil's answer, considering you're leading a campaign that says no more faith schools? Do you agree that faith schools do kind of contribute to the common good?
Yes, schools contribute to the common good. All schools. I mean, if I were to set up a Christian dentist, that would be contributing to the common good. But would that be the best way to do it? We don't think so. I'm not sure how much further you'd like me to go on that. I'm not pretending that all faith schools are as bad and as awful as the worst examples. You know, one thing we've come back to again and again is this admissions issue. I don't know, is that issues of your admissions policy, but I'm very clear that not all faith schools discriminate in admissions. Not all faith schools have homophobic teachings in their schools, though many do. You've talked about how Section 48 inspections work in your school, but in many schools, Section 48 inspections are designed to ensure that school is promoting a rigorous religious ethos as its #1 priority.
Thank you. Sunilji, I still want to bring you into this, considering that Alistair has spoken about that, yes, it does promote or it does contribute to the common good of people, but yet again, faith schools are divisive. They are differentiating and projecting their faith as the only true faith, if I may take the liberty to use those phrases.
Yeah, and that's the problem. And it comes back to this point I made earlier about two approaches to faith. The first approach, which is immature approach, is called exclusivism. And exclusivism essentially means only my way and everyone else is wrong. You know, it's an immature understanding of faith. But intrinsic to the Hindu faith is what we call inclusivism. That Hinduism believes that we haven't got a monopoly on God. We haven't got a monopoly on how to pray or anything like that. We haven't got a monopoly on these values, that actually there is truths in other religions. So actually one of the 5 British values is tolerance of those of a different faith. Well, one step above that is appreciation of those with a different faith. Because ultimately, in not getting too philosophical now, but ultimately the reality is one, but worshipped in different ways, seen in different perspectives. So from a Hindu approach, there's no Muslim God, Christian God, Jewish God, and a Hindu God. God is God. Okay, people might call him different names, see him in a different way. So when a Hindu sees a Muslim praying to Allah, and then he goes and he sees a Christian praying to God, he actually appreciates that both of them are actually praying in their own unique way, in their own personal way. And rather than seeing a them and us mentality, he actually sees, you know, a sense of interconnectedness, a point I made earlier with the wider community, which is why in our school, it's a requirement that every half term, remember there's 6 of them, children go out to different places of worship, understand those religions. It's inbuilt in the curriculum that at least 15% of the curriculum is comparative religion. We have, you know, Buddhist monks coming into our school presenting theirs. We have, you know, the local Jewish school. In fact, we started an initiative where, you know, other schools were asking our children, please, can your children come to our school and do an assembly on Diwali or something like that? You know, all student led. So we had year 6 children creating PowerPoints, saying everything they wanted to say. And literally my job was to drive them there, you know, take pictures and bring them back. We have Muslim children coming to our school. So I think, you know, reaching out to other schools of other faiths is essential in helping to expose children to the variety of people that make up British society. And I think that should be at the forefront of any school. There have been occasions, so just to finish off, where our children went to, there's one incident where our children went to a football competition. And when the next day afterwards, I asked one student, how did you go? He goes, yeah, we won. He goes, can I speak to you? Something happened. I goes, what do you mean? He goes, some of the children from the school were making fun of us because we're from a faith school. So then I was like, well, how did it make you feel? And he said, I just felt sorry for them. I goes, did you want to react back to them? He goes, no, because, you know, I know better than that. So I think, you know, if anything, it works the other way as well. Non-faith schools should also, you know, be exposed to people of different faiths. So it's a two-way thing.
Thank you for that, Sunil. I'd just like to focus on the point that you made about integration. According to you, there's a lot of integration happening between non-faith schools and faith schools, according to you. Alistair, what is your take on that? According to Sunil, there's integration, successful integration happening between non-faith students who go to a state school and students who go to a faith school. What is your take on that?
I mean, it'd be really easy for me to hold up a straw man of like the terrible, you know, the worst example of a faith school and argue against that. Sunil is setting out a model of a much more liberal than many faith schools, and many of the harms, which are much, you know, the extreme harms in other schools, are not or much less in this. There's often a talk about in this sort of integration idea I don't know if you ever seen the series Derry Girls. It's so bad it's good. It's set in Derry in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and there's a one episode where they get children from the Catholic school and the Protestant school together, and it always, whenever I see things like this sort of bringing people together like artificially, when they would already be, if we didn't have setting it up as separate schools, the children of the different faiths and beliefs would already be, we wouldn't need to have the football tournament between different schools and faith schools and non-faith schools. They'd be there playing together on the playground already.
Thank you for that, Alistair. I am very conscious of time, but we still have a couple of questions. This question is from Nakul Rajani, and it's to the entire panel. The question is, what does an England without faith schools look like? I would like to direct this question to Minlib first and have the other speakers to reflect on it.
Well, I've been in England for 5 years, so and I have to say that it's a picture I cannot imagine. I don't know how to imagine ex nihilo. I don't know what to look like. I don't think there is I can keep, there's not a picture I can imagine. That's it.
Thank you, Minlib. Alistair, what is your take on the question? What does an England without faith schools look like?
A sunny, uplit land where all problems are solved. No, in many ways, not that different. For many things, schools would continue to do. We just would all of the good things that have been spoken about happening in faith schools, those would be continuing to happen in all schools, but we would just not have all the negative and nastier sides that come with faith schools. So in some ways, not hugely different, but for many people, a big difference.
Thank you, Alistair. Sunilji, your remarks on that question.
Sorry. Without faith schools, I think it will be more academically driven. Success will simply be based more on academics. What grades you have, how much money you've got, assets you own. I think it would lead to a lack of appreciation and exposure of people of faith, and therefore creating uncertainty, negativity against people of faith. And therefore, I think they're very much needed in schools.
Thank you. A leading question to that would be, so what do we do about cases where faith may go against secular values such as LGBTQ+?
Yeah, very, very interesting. We've been grappling with this as well. The teaching, we've seen examples in Birmingham of what happens with, certain people of faith and, these sorts of issues. But that's the beauty of, at least with Hinduism, that it appreciates that the world is diverse, many, many different people with many, many different beliefs and ethoses to ourselves. And because it's inclusive, it's accommodating of that. It doesn't mean to say then, well, if people are doing this, I should also do that. It helps one to retain their own personal values whilst appreciating at the same time things that might not be according to their values. And I think that's the most important thing. So for example, in our school, in one of our schools in London, the head of Sanskrit, so we follow the national curriculum plus yoga, meditation, and Sanskrit on top. The head of Sanskrit is actually from the LGBT community. He's a practicing Hindu, and at the same time, he's the head of Sanskrit, so he's a very prominent position. So it's about appreciating that not everyone thinks like you, there are differences, and even though I might not believe in them, maybe I might not promote them, but at least I respect, and I won't do anything negative to them for that. So I think that's the balance there, where you can have traditional faith values and at the same time be accepting of other issues that may fall outside of that.
Minlib, I'd like to direct the same question to you. What do we do about cases where faith may go against secular values? such as LGBTQ+.
Yeah, I mean, maybe in Hinduism, the problem is less acute than in Christianity. And then across the board, Christians fall into different categories. So this is one of the difficulties of faith tradition. I mean, the problem there is that they root their opposition to a particular way of life into a revealed text, right? So the difficulty then for believers is how you reconcile those two, how you reconcile those two. But I think what matters most is that what kind of protection, right, is afforded to different ways of life. And those kind of protection must be respected across the board. If you are a believer or you're not a believer or whatever it is, So the rule of law should apply. It's not because somebody is LGBT that you could discriminate against. You know what I'm saying? So the rule of law should be equally applicable to all of us. And faith people just have to take it. That's the way I see it.
Thank you, Minlib. I would love for our question and answers to go back and forth, but unfortunately, that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. Thank you to all our audiences for those excellent questions. I'd like to now move on to the panelists' closing remarks. So Minlib, I'd like to start with you. Could you please present your closing remarks?
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So for me, the debate, once again, for me, the debate is how do a particular community, right, organize schooling and education, right, offer, if you put it that way, quality education to the larger number of their community. That community is cosmopolitan. It has different ways of appreciating values, right? So for me, this is it. How we do it so that we don't create unnecessary discrimination or unnecessary hatred, where some people feel like, because of their faith, they are cut off, or because of lack of, they are cut off. How you create a community, that's particularly when talking about schools. So for me, what is needed is to undermine inequality in terms of access to quality education. And faith schools have the responsibility to pay attention to that which remains problematic in the way they function. That's it.
Thank you very much for your closing remarks, Minlib. Sunil, your closing remarks, please.
Okay. I think, just to leave everyone with a final thought, is faith in schools good or bad? Really depends on the practitioners of those faiths and how they teach to those children. I don't believe faith is inherently bad. I believe you have bad practitioners of faith, fanatical, immature interpretations of that faith. Just like in sport, Lance Armstrong, I don't want to name names, but there you go. After what he did, does it make cycling bad? No. Does it make him a bad sports person? Yes. I think the same principle applies to faith in schools. I think there's an obvious gap in the emphasis of academics and morality and character formation and developing qualities of compassion, understanding, integrity, self-discipline, and respect. I think that gap is now bigger in the year 2020 than probably at any point it has been. I think faith schools are a very important tool in bridging that gap. Not the only tool, but a very important tool if it's done in the right way. And finally, I want to say that, to end the stigma of faith schools, because, there is plenty of negative connotations, I want to actually use this opportunity that when it's safe and social distancing, we can, anyway, whenever it's safe, I want to extend an invitation to people who want to come and see the school and see how it's not necessarily a binary choice, either you're Hindu or religious, but you can't be in society, how you can actually marry the two together, that you can be a fully practicing Hindu and at the same time be a full, respecting, valued member of British society. And I think Avanti Schools, even though not on a massive scale, at least in a small scale, is leading the way of showing how we can bridge that gap, how we can marry those two whilst retaining one sense of identity. So that invitation is open to the VM team. It's open to Alistair, Minlib, and anyone else who's watching. Please come check us out and see some of the work that we do. It's not perfect by any means, but we're not after perfection. We're after progression.
Thank you so much for your closing remarks, Sunil. Lastly, Alistair, your closing remarks to the audience, please.
Thank you very much for having this, not a debate, but a discussion and a churn of ideas. It's interesting that, I mean, there's a few arguments that are almost always put forward for faith schools that I think are just terrible arguments that can easily be dismissed, and we haven't heard those arguments today. We've heard a more nuanced argument for faith schools, and for people like me who suggest that we should be moving beyond faith schools towards this community ethos school system, it's easier to argue against the more extreme things, but to actually listen to that more nuanced argument and to take it on board, and then to say, well, actually, if we want to build consensus and legitimacy for this move towards community education, how can we recognize the history that Minlib has talked about? How can we recognize the positive character approaches to education that Sunil has talked about? And I would argue that we don't necessarily need to agree on every aspect of our destination to begin to address some of these issues, and to begin, and even supporters of faith schools can say we should be stopping discrimination in our schools. We should be stopping discriminatory teachings. We should be having more open schools, and maybe I would see that a more liberal type of faith school, if we can move in that direction. And then maybe not everyone wants then to keep moving to get to the fully community school system, but let's at least try and build that and move in that direction. So if we want to have an inclusive society where people of all different faiths and beliefs and backgrounds can work together, then let's start doing that in our schools.
Thank you, Alistair. And thank you, gentlemen, for your closing remarks. Thank you all for watching tonight's Vicharamanthan. I hope that it has given you some food for thought. Vicharamanthan is all about the exploration of ideas rather than providing solutions. I encourage you all to take at least one thought-provoking idea from tonight into your own homes and carry on the manthan in your lives. Thank you to our expert witnesses, Dr. Minlib Dal, Alistair Lichton, and Sunil Randev, for joining us today. Thank you to you all for taking the time out and being with us here this evening. Your attendance and support enables us to continue our work. And finally, thank you once again to our well-wishers for their continuous support. With your contributions, we are able to successfully host these events. If you would like to become our well-wisher, visit our website for more information. You can find us on www.vicharmanthan.org. That is Vichar, spelt with a double A. Join our mailing list, have a scroll through our past events, and enjoy watching the previous videos. Feel free to also add us on Facebook and Instagram to keep updated with future events and all our posts. We also hold weekly book clubs across our VM chapters. So if you would like to join our book club, please get in touch via our website. Before we go, I'd like to let you all know that we're having our next Vicharamanthan on Saturday, the 13th of June. That's 2 weeks from now. The event is titled, Does Gender Affect Leadership? Exploring the Qualities of a Balanced Leader. Good night, everybody, and I hope you'll join us in 2 weeks' time for our next Vicharamanthan. Take care and stay safe. Namaste.